Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I've kept the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse for 15 years. She's an old screw-pile structure planted into the shallows of the Chesapeake Bay just off Annapolis, Maryland. Hexagonal, red-roofed, and steady as the tides. It's the kind of place most people think of as haunted or forgotten, but to me, she's home. Wind, fog, waves, every night is the same rhythm, the same solitude. Until 3 nights ago. The forecast had called for calm seas and scattered clouds. I'd finished my usual inspection of the Fresnel lens before midnight. Everything checked out. No salt fog on the upper catwalk glass, no corrosion along the power conduits, backup generator fueled and operational. It's habit now. Ritual. I keep the place immaculate, even if no one's watching. The light matters. Always has. Around 2:20 a.m., the radio cracked. Not a transmission, just static. Then a faint click, like someone keying a mic and letting it go. That happens sometimes. The VHF Channel 16 is monitored by boaters, the Coast Guard, NOAA, anyone on the water. Sometimes a drunk kayaker thinks he's a DJ, but this wasn't that. A few minutes later, I stepped out onto the east catwalk for a wind check. That's when I saw it. There was a cargo ship maybe a mile out, starboard lights barely visible against the Black Sea. No radio hail, no engine thrum. Just drifting. I grabbed my binoculars and focused. The ship was a Liberian-flagged bulk freighter. Rust-streaked, listing slightly to port. I could make out the name. MV Heron Sky. I recognized it. She passed the lighthouse 6 weeks earlier on her way to the port of Baltimore carrying grain from Argentina, but she wasn't scheduled to return. Not now, not here. And she was dead in the water. By 3 a.m., the tide had shifted. The Heron Sky began to angle toward the rocky shoals southwest of the lighthouse. I tried raising the Coast Guard on the radio. Nothing. I flipped over to channel 22A. Still nothing. That's when I fired the emergency flare. I keep a few marine red parachutes in a waterproof canister by the trapdoor hatch. Standard issue. I launched one high and bright over the wreck's path. Still no movement on deck. The ship ran aground just before dawn. I watched the hull scrape the outer reef in slow motion, the metal shrieking against the rock, echoing over the water like a dying whale. A wave washed over her bow, and she tilted again, then stopped. I had to know what happened. I readied the skiff. An old 12-foot aluminum sea nymph with a 6-horsepower Tohatsu I keep fueled and tied under the dock frame. Conditions were good, minimal chop, low wind. I packed my flare gun, 2 waterproof radios, a flashlight, a flare beacon, and an old Coast Guard-approved M1911 sidearm. My father left it to me. I never had to fire it in all my years here, just kept it clean. By the time I reached the wreck, the sun was cresting the bay, casting the ship's rusted hull in orange light. The name Heron Sky was painted in chipped white letters across the stern. I circled once, looking for a ladder or cargo net, then tied off to a steel cleat and climbed aboard near the starboard hatch. The deck smelled of brine and something else, something metallic and spoiled, like rot. There were bodies. At first, I thought they were dead. Emaciated men, curled and collapsed in twisted positions, their skin gray-blue and pulled tight over their skulls like they'd been starving for weeks, but their eyes twitched. One of them opened his mouth and hissed, a low, ragged inhale through bloodless gums. Then another moved. They weren't dead, but they weren't alive either. One of them lunged. I fell back, crashing against a stack of oil drums. My shoulder lit up in pain, and the M1911 clattered to the deck. The man, or thing, scrabbled toward me on all fours. His hands were raw, with cracked fingernails and open sores between the knuckles. The eyes were milky and unfocused. I kicked him in the ribs and crawled backward until I reached the edge. I shoved him hard, and he toppled over the side, striking the water with a slap. Then I grabbed my pistol, fired a warning shot into the sky, and made for the skiff. The others were stirring now, at least 6 of them, rising like spiders from piles of rags. I barely made it off the wreck. As I sped back to the lighthouse, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The ship's containers weren't just grain. Some had military stenciling, black letters on olive gray steel. One was marked CDC Quarantine Module. Another had the UN biohazard symbol. Whatever was in that hold, it didn't come from Argentina. Back at the lighthouse, I sealed the dock trapdoor and disabled the winch. Then I shut off the light. Not standard procedure, but I didn't want to draw anything else in. That night, I logged everything. Coordinates, conditions, ship markings, cargo containers, number of infected, their state. I tried calling it in. Still no response on any channel. At dawn, I checked my email. There was a disconnected message from an old friend, Simon Vargas, now stationed at the NOAA Center for Weather and Climate Prediction in College Park. He used to be Navy Meteorological. The email subject line was Alert, Quarantine Drifts. The body was scrambled, only the final line came through clearly. They're not coming by land. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I've seen more ships. Last night, it was a fishing trawler out of Portland, Maine. The North Water. No lights, no movement, just drifted past at 1 knot with torn nets and oil-streaked windows. The night before that, a derelict yacht half sunk, radio mast bent, sails torn. Some of the infected were on deck, standing like statues, heads tilted toward the shore. Like they were waiting for something. I haven't slept more than an hour at a time. I keep watch with binoculars, scanning the water in 360 degrees. The infected don't respond to noise, not unless it's close. I've tested it. Threw a crowbar into the water from the catwalk once. One of them turned its head, that's all. I don't know if they need to breathe. I'm not sure they eat. Some of them just stand there, swaying slightly with the movement of the ship, eyes unfocused, like they're listening to something. Today, I saw the first one reach shore. It was during low tide, maybe 10:40 a.m. A man, what was left of him, emerged from the surf near Beverly Triton Beach, just 3 miles west of the lighthouse. I saw him through my spotting scope, walking slowly, dragging 1 foot, salt water pouring from his clothes. A fisherman was nearby, casting into the shallows. He never saw it coming. By the time I radioed anyone, Coast Guard, State Police, even local fire departments, the line was dead. Not static now, just silence. At 14 o'clock hours, I hiked to the top of the lighthouse for a wider scan. I counted 3 new hulls on the horizon. 2 container ships, one larger than the Heron Skyall, unlit, all drifting toward land. The outbreak isn't starting in cities. It's arriving quietly, on the tide. I don't think I'm supposed to know this. I'm just a lighthouse keeper. But now, I see what's coming. A maritime infection. Something that spreads not in crowds, but through bilge water, enclosed spaces, ventilation systems on ships, sealed compartments that preserve the infected like cargo. I think the authorities knew. The flares didn't bring anyone. The hails were ignored. There's no broadcast emergency on NOAA frequencies. No warnings to coastal towns. But the ships keep coming. And tomorrow, I plan to break the chain. If there's another drifting freighter by morning, I'll do more than just watch. I have a marine incendiary charge from the old emergency kit, designed to destroy a raft or a small boat, but I can rig it. The charge is magnesium-based, waterproof, and burns at over 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In oxygen-rich environments like an open cargo deck or fuel-soaked interior, it could turn a steel hull into a floating furnace. I've never used it before. It was meant for last resorts, if the station ever caught fire, or if I needed to eliminate a lifeboat under pirate threat. It came with strict regulations back when the Coast Guard last inspected this station in 2011. That protocol doesn't matter anymore. Not after what I've seen. I worked all night in the maintenance bay under the tower, modifying the charge casing. I needed to delay the ignition, give myself enough time to board, plant it deep in the ship's central deck, and make it back to the skiff. The standard tripwire system was useless here. Instead, I wired in a salvaged kitchen timer from the service galley and fused the igniter to a waterproof relay. I tested the circuit 3 times. The LED flickered, then held steady. Countdown starts at 15 minutes. Short, but just long enough. If I fail, there won't be a second chance. There's no backup crew, no one to find the wreckage. Just me, the sea, and whatever comes next. At 5:42, as the sky began to lighten, the shape of a new freighter emerged over the horizon. It was close. Too close. My guess was 5 miles out, drifting slowly with the eastern current, maybe half a knot. Through my binoculars, I could make out the registration. Artemis Crown. A Norwegian-flagged vessel, 870 feet long, built for chemical transport. No running lights, no AIS beacon on the NOAA map overlay. She wasn't supposed to be here. What stood out immediately was the scorch damage near the forward deck. Something had burned up there, black streaks running down the bow, warped metal around one of the cranes. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Maybe a few days old. And through the midship observation windows I could just make out movement. Not rapid, not aggressive, just standing. I geared up before sunrise. Wetsuit beneath my clothes in case I needed to ditch into the water. Rope harness, flare gun, M1911 sidearm with 6 spare mags, waterproof flashlight, and the modified incendiary pack slung in an old dry bag over my shoulder. I topped off the outboard motor, checked the seals on the fuel line, and ran a final test pull. The engine coughed to life, sputtered, then held steady. At 6:30, I left the lighthouse behind, skiff bouncing over a rising tide, mist curling around the bow like fingers. By the time I reached the Artemis Crown, the sun had cleared the tree line on the horizon, casting amber light across her massive hull. She wasn't listing. She was still buoyant, her draft line riding low. That meant her cargo tanks were full. Dangerous. If she'd been carrying any form of toxic or flammable load, it could complicate everything. But the placards were scratched out. Someone had tried to obscure them deliberately. I could still make out the red square of a Class 3 hazardous liquid sticker. Either gasoline, methanol, or something more volatile. If I triggered the incendiary too close to a tank, the explosion could be visible from Baltimore. I found a boarding ladder still deployed on the port side, half submerged and rusted. I tied off and climbed. The deck was silent. Salt crust clung to every surface. The hatch to the forward bridge was open, swaying slightly with the breeze. I stepped inside slowly, flashlight drawn. The interior stank of mildew and something else, like chemical burn mixed with meat gone sour. In the main corridor, I passed a safety board that listed the crew manifest. 22 names. Norwegian, Filipino, Polish. Beneath each name, someone had scrawled red paint, crossed out lines, symbols I didn't recognize. Nordic runes, maybe, or someone's idea of warding. It felt ritualistic, not official. In the galley, I found signs of struggle. Chairs overturned. Scratched linoleum. Empty tins and broken plates. No blood, but the walls were smeared with salt residue and handprints. I pressed forward toward the lower decks. My plan was to reach the cargo hold access on level C and plant the charge near the auxiliary diesel tanks. I knew enough about this class of vessel to guess where they'd be, beneath the central spine, between the structural bulkheads. The stairs creaked under my weight. My heart thudded louder than my boots. I didn't speak, didn't breathe too hard. I knew they were down there. I could feel it in the stillness of the ship. Level C was dark. Emergency lights flickered above the watertight doors. One of them was jammed open by a fire axe driven into the base. The air was thicker here, humid and warm despite the open sea. I passed what looked like a decontamination station hastily set up outside the hold. Yellow biohazard tape, a few sealed respirators, a medical pack. All torn open. Empty. When I entered the main cargo corridor, I saw them. 4 crewmen, maybe more, standing shoulder to shoulder along the far bulkhead. Not moving. Eyes wide, mouths slightly open, like mannequins set in place. One of them turned his head toward me as I crept past. No shout, no lunge. Just the slow roll of his neck and a soft exhale that rattled like water in the lungs. I planted the charge near the tank console. Magnetic mount, timer already set, 15 minutes and counting. Then I heard the noise behind me. It started low, a dragging sound, boots on steel coming from the service tunnel behind the hold. One figure, then another, then a third. I didn't wait to count. I turned and ran, flashlight swinging in wild arcs, my boots slamming down the corridor. I could hear them now, not sprinting, but shuffling in rhythm like a slow hunt. Closer. Steady. The stairwell up to level B was slick. I nearly slipped but caught the railing. At the top I drew my M1911 and fired once into the wall to distract them. Metal sparked, a deafening clang, but they didn't flinch. Whatever reflexes they once had were buried deep. They moved only with purpose, not fear. I burst onto the upper deck, lungs on fire. The sun blinded me for a second, but I found the ladder. Climbed, dropped. Hit the skiff hard and cranked the engine with trembling hands. It started on the second pull. I was 30 yards out when the fire erupted. First came the rumble, a deep vibration in the water, then the sound, a hollow thud like a depth charge going off underwater, then light. The central hold split open in a geyser of flame, heat rushing out in a rolling wave. The Artemis crown heaved upward, her spine cracking as if she'd been punched from within. Black smoke curled into the sky like a signal. I didn't look back again. I reached the lighthouse at 8:22. Threw the skiff mooring up by hand, arms shaking, and collapsed inside the trapdoor vestibule. My face was raw from wind and salt. My clothes reeked of diesel and sweat. But I was alive. I logged the detonation, marked the coordinates, wrote down every detail I could remember. Vessel size, shape, flag, number of infected, possible crew condition. I catalog every encounter now, not for the government, not for the CDC, for myself, to stay sane. But even as I sat at the workbench and tried to control my breathing, I knew it wasn't over. That ship was just one of many, a symptom, not the source. That night, I powered the main lens again. The beacon cut through the bay like a blade. I knew it would draw attention, maybe even invite trouble, but I couldn't risk another ship passing unseen. At 1:37 a.m., the radar pinged. Another contact, smaller, a pleasure cruiser, maybe 40 feet, heading northwest toward Thomas Point State Park. No response on any frequency. And then, for the first time in days, my radio came to life. A man's voice, hoarse, crackling. "Repeat, any working station along the mid-Atlantic coast. This is Dr. Jules Cohen aboard Solstice. We're not infected. Request immediate guidance. We have proof of marine transmission vector. Repeat, we have proof. Then static. I jumped to respond, Solstice. This is Thomas Point Light. Copy. Dr. Cohen, I read you. Repeat your last. What do you have proof of? Are you under pursuit? No reply. Just white noise. But the name stuck with me. Dr. Jules Cohen. That wasn't a fisherman or tourist. I remembered it from a paper I'd read years ago. Marine Pathology, Harvard Medical. He'd worked on long-term oceanic viral containment projects. Had contracts with both the CDC and NOAA. His name had appeared in a 2015 white paper on deep-water viral survivability in ballast tank ecosystems, co-authored with a German epidemiologist who later disappeared while studying cholera mutation strains off the West African coast. I didn't have a photographic memory, but I remembered what caught my attention back then. The phrase reverse latency events. It meant viruses that didn't degrade in seawater, but hibernated. If Dr. Cohen was still alive and transmitting from a vessel called Solstice, then he either escaped from one of the plague ships or had been tracking them. And if he had proof, I needed to find him. At dawn, I plotted the estimated drift line of the Solstice using a maritime ruler, wind data from NOAA, and the known current vectors along the western Chesapeake. If Cohen had last transmitted from somewhere near Kent Island, and the Solstice was adrift, it would likely follow the flow between Bloody Point Bar and the Narrows west of Stevensville. I couldn't use AIS tracking. The boat's transponder was either disabled or non-functional, but I still had my 7X50 Fujinon binocs, a foghorn, and the knowledge of every light pattern, buoy, and shadow in these waters. I left before 6 o'clock, tide coming in. The sky was low, full of dull gray clouds, and the water had that oily texture that warned of a storm system building farther south. I fueled the skiff to capacity and brought extra canisters this time, just in case I had to detour or run at wide throttle. No weapons except the sidearm. This wasn't a demolition mission. If Cohen was alive, I needed him talking, not running. 40 minutes later, I rounded the edge of Kent Island's southern spit and began threading the marshy lanes toward the western side. The further I went, the quieter the water became. No boaters, no crabbers. Even the birds were scarce. I passed the rusted hull of an old tug near Love Point, half sunk, barnacle-encrusted, and leaking an iridescent film. I logged it, but didn't stop. At 7:12, I saw her. The Solstice was a 46-foot Beneteau Oceanus, fiberglass hull, dark blue stripe along the waterline. She floated still, no sail, mast intact but rigging limp. I saw movement through the starboard saloon window, too quick to be a drifting object. I cut the motor to idle and approached slowly. Solstice, this is Thomas Point Lightkeeper, I called through the handheld VHF. Dr. Cohen, if you're aboard, I'm approaching on a skiff. I'm not infected, I'm armed but not hostile. I received your transmission last night. No answer. I circled once, kept distance, watched the windows. Still nothing. Then a faint knock. Not on the radio, on the hull. I swung around the stern and saw him. A man in his early 50s, bearded, sunburned, wearing a soaked lab coat over a dry suit. He was leaning out of the open cockpit companionway holding a flare gun. Not pointed at me, but held in both hands like a warning. "You really? From the Lighthouse?" he asked. "Yes," I replied. "Thomas Point. I heard your broadcast. You said you had proof." He didn't lower the flare gun, but he waved me closer. I tied off and boarded the Solstice, hands raised, making sure he saw the sidearm holstered and untouched. He looked me over, eyes bloodshot but clear. He hadn't slept much, but he wasn't infected. Inside, the yacht reeked of iodine, fuel, and mildew. Charts were taped across the galley walls, vector paths, coastal maps, satellite overlays. A laptop with a shattered screen lay in the sink, sparking intermittently. He motioned me below deck, where 2 of the crew bunks had been converted into a makeshift biolab. "I'm all that's left," Cohen said finally. "The others are either dead or adrift. We were collecting ballast water samples from quarantine ships 3 weeks ago under contract for the Joint Maritime Disease Surveillance Network. No one told us the true nature of what we were studying." He handed me a sealed Ziploc with 4 vials inside, each filled with a cloudy amber fluid labeled in Sharpie: Heron, Sky Deep Bay 7, Artemis, and Recum B24. These are from 4 different vessels. Each one contains marine-adapted viral traces, not degraded, viable. One strain's RNA pattern resembles a modified lyssavirus. Another matches prions found in preserved thermophile samples from deep-sea vent ecosystems. They're not natural. Someone cultivated them, and they survived saltwater exposure for weeks. Cohen walked me through the evidence: temperature logs, contamination curves, crew symptom logs. He had voice notes, though some were corrupted. The most chilling one was from a man whispering through what sounded like rebreather gear. Stage 3 onset, crew hearing voices from vents, no rational speech. Self-harm escalating, engines failing, they're walking in their sleep. "They don't die in the traditional sense," Cohen said. "They metabolize slowly, lose higher brain function but retain motor ability. That's why they don't decay quickly. The infection isn't airborne, not yet, but it's waterborne, and every ship that crosses an international channel brings it closer." I asked him why the government hadn't sounded the alarm. "Because they already tried to contain it. The Artemis, the Heron, those were controlled burn attempts. They let them drift far enough from land, then eliminated the evidence, but it didn't work. Some of them made it to shore before ignition. Others escaped from their own crews. Some crews willingly hid them." "Why?" I asked. "Belief," he said simply. "Some thought they were evolving, transcending." I read logs that described the infected as a listening to the sea. Some religious nonsense. Others just couldn't let go of their loved ones. It spread before they could admit it had begun. We spent 2 hours reviewing his data. By the time I stepped back into the cockpit, I felt like I'd been doused in cold water. This wasn't just an outbreak. It was an invisible invasion, quiet, slow, and undeniable. Before we parted, Cohen gave me a waterproof flash drive with all his findings. He was heading south toward Wallops Island, Virginia. He believed there was a NOAA facility there with sealed labs that hadn't been compromised yet. I offered to go with him, but he shook his head. "If you're out there, burning infected ships and keeping the light on, you're more valuable where you are," he said. "You're the last early warning system this coast has." We exchanged comm protocols, short bursts on Channel 9 at midnight daily, and then I watched as the Solstice motored south, her diesel engine coughing to life like an old heart. I returned to the lighthouse by late afternoon. The wind had picked up and the horizon was turning brown-gray with heat haze. At 19:03, the radar lit up again. 2 new vessels entering the bay. Both silent. Both drifting. The first was a Chinese container ship. Xinghaiju registry expired. The second, a U.S.-flagged NOAA research vessel, Healy's Gate. That one chilled me. If even the research fleets were compromised, it meant the virus had found a way into government corridors. I set the beacon lens to full rotational speed and prepped the second incendiary. I had to board them both. Catalog, confirm, and destroy if necessary. But that night, as I sat in the crow's nest watching the stars disappear behind the smoke drifting eastward, I began to notice something new. The infected were adapting. They were standing in clearer formations now, spaced evenly across the decks, hands on railings, eyes not vacant anymore, but facing the lighthouse, watching the light. Not random anymore, purposeful. And somewhere below, in the deep channels of the bay, sonar was picking up strange echoes, metallic thuds, hollow knocks, like ballast shifting in the hull of something massive just beneath the surface. It didn't sound like waves lapping against steel. It wasn't the groan of tidal stress on an old hull. These were deliberate, repeating. Not fast, but paced like a slow heartbeat. Too rhythmic to be coincidence, too mechanical to be natural. I first picked them up on my portable fish finder unit. It's an old Humminbird 798 CI, not exactly military grade, but it gives clean returns if you know how to interpret the depth shading. I'd mounted the transducer along the north-facing dock post weeks ago, mostly to watch for curious dolphins or passing wrecks. What it showed me now was a blurred elliptical shape resting deep in the shipping channel, nearly 60 feet down. It was long, over 800 feet, possibly more. It hadn't been there before. I double-checked the depth logs. That section of the bay wasn't supposed to be navigable for vessels of that size. No recent traffic records showed a ship that large. And if it were a wreck, there would have been debris, oil slicks, at least some chatter on marine channels. But there was nothing. Just the knocking. I listened through the night. Every 17 minutes, the sonar would register another pulse. 3 distinct clangs, like something hollow being struck from the inside. And by 2 o'clock, I noticed something else. The infected on the derelict ships were responding. They began turning toward the channel. Some left their positions on deck and shuffled to the bow, leaning out as if trying to see through the dark. Others stood perfectly still, arms limp at their sides, eyes trained toward the same point of origin. I counted at least 5 vessels drifting within visible range by then, most half-submerged or burning low from internal fires I hadn't started. But every infected person on them, all of them, seemed to know something was beneath them. The knock wasn't just a sound, it was a signal. I spent the following day gathering everything I had: logs, sonar prints, Dr. Cohen's drive, photos from the Artemis Crown, audio clips, video timestamps. I copied them onto 2 encrypted USBs and sealed one in a waterproof float capsule. If anything happened to me, I needed someone to find it. I left it wedged inside the base of the old fog bell tower, buried beneath a stone marked with faded red paint. The other copy stayed with me. At 1840 that evening, just before sundown, I made the decision to investigate. I didn't want to. Every part of my instinct told me not to touch whatever was sitting under the water, but I also knew no one else would. I was the closest, the best equipped, and at that point, probably the only person within range who still gave a damn. I prepped the skiff for a dive. The last time I'd used the scuba rig was during an inspection in 2016 when a barge clipped the lighthouse's southern mooring cables. The gear was dusty, the tanks still pressurized, the wetsuit hanging dry in the locker. I tested every seal twice, flushed the regulator lines, charged the dive torch, and packed a weighted drop line so I could return quickly if needed. It wasn't the ideal setup, but it would get me down there. By 20 o'clock, the bay was dark again. Moonless sky, heavy cloud cover. I navigated by GPS and dead reckoning, heading straight for the sonar contact point. As I approached, the knocking intensified. Not in volume, but in vibration. The hull of my skiff began to shudder softly, like it was picking up resonance from something below. When I killed the engine and dropped anchor, the water felt unnaturally still. Not calm, still, no wind, no movement. just the creak of fiberglass and my own breath in my ears. I dropped into the water at 2023. The descent was slow. Visibility dropped below 10 feet within the first 20 meters. The beam of my dive light cut through the murk in a tight cone. Small particles, algae, sediment, floated like snow. At 50 feet, the pressure started to press into my mask. I equalized and dropped further, following the line until my hand brushed something that wasn't rock. It was metal, cold, coated in barnacles and algae slime, but manufactured. I swung the light along the surface. The structure beneath me wasn't a traditional hull. It was segmented, ribbed, and covered in sensor nodes and fiber optic cables. Some cut, others pulsing with a faint orange glow. This wasn't a freighter. It wasn't even a conventional submersible. This was a habitat, a mobile aquatic lab, likely modular, with satellite uplinks and deep current stabilizers. I recognized the design from NOAA schematics I'd studied years ago. It matched a prototype known as the DSH-92, Deep Sea Habitat. 92, part of a Cold War-era research program built to test long-term pathogen survivability under pressure. But this one wasn't abandoned. As I circled the central spine, my light caught something that froze me in place. A viewport, circular, reinforced, set into the hull. Behind it, a face. Pale. Pressed against the glass, eyes open. It didn't blink. There were others, maybe a dozen more, visible through the lower portholes. Suspended in water or locked behind interior chambers. Floating, half naked, their skin shriveled and veined with deep black lines. Not corpses. Preserved, infected, controlled, monitored. This was a lab and a vault. And the knocking. I found it, a mechanical arm, possibly automated, striking a steel panel inside the central drum in regular intervals. A timed pulse, likely meant for sonar triangulation or coded communication. Someone, or something, was using it to call the others. They were coordinating. I surfaced fast, too fast. My lungs burned, ears popped, and I coughed blood into the mask on the way up, but I didn't stop. I hit the skiff at full drag, yanked my gear off, and fired up the motor with shaking hands. I didn't look back. Didn't check sonar. I just drove. Back at the lighthouse, I collapsed inside the service room and vomited seawater until I could breathe normally. I wrapped myself in thermal blankets and stared at the wall for hours, unable to process what I'd seen. The infection wasn't an accident. It wasn't a random mutation. It had been built monitored, and when containment failed, it had been submerged. The ships I'd destroyed weren't part of a spread, they were part of a release pattern carriers, directed by pulse and drift and time. And now, the infected were organizing. At 2:11 a.m., I received another transmission, not from Cohen. This one came from an encrypted frequency I didn't recognize. Voice masked, digital interference layered across it. Thomas Point Light, your location is compromised. You are advised to evacuate immediately. Further action is unauthorized. Secure remaining intel and await extraction orders. Do not engage habitat. Repeat, do not engage habitat. Then silence. They knew I'd found it. I didn't respond. I powered down the main light and blacked out the windows. Whatever extraction meant, I wasn't waiting around for it. I packed the second flash drive, every notebook, every sonar printout, and sealed them into a steel dive case. Then I climbed to the crow's nest with my flare gun and signaled once. High, white, triple burst. Cohen would understand. If he made it to Wallops Island, maybe he could still get this out. Maybe someone could stop the full release. At sunrise, I watched as more ships arrived. 6, maybe 7. All silent, all drifting. Their decks weren't empty anymore. And then I saw them. not the infected. Boats, civilian vessels, fishermen, sailboats, kayaks, people who didn't know what they were approaching. The infected on the decks turned in unison, and from beneath the bay, the knocking stopped. Not because it was over, because it didn't need to call anymore. They were already here, and I was the last light on the coast still burning. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.